Good morning. The last time I spoke, I talked about consciousness. We are aware of ourselves, we are aware of our environment, and we are aware of ourselves in our environment. I believe that all living things could indeed possess some form of consciousness. And last time I also spoke about the possibility that non-living things could have a form of consciousness as well. Today, I'm going to talk about ancient mystical and modern scientific beliefs about consciousness and the nature of reality. But before I do so, I really have to share three wonderful examples I found since the last time I talked about animal and plant consciousness. So the first one, slide please, has to do with these creatures. Now, these are ants. And what you're seeing is them shooting formic acid out of their abdomens together. And we have the next slide, please. That's another example. When they're threatened by another animal, maybe that wants to have lunch on ants, they do that. And then you can imagine how effective that would be if, let's say, an animal is putting their face in an ant nest and they get their eyes all full of acid. And it really works to deter predators that way. And it actually gets better because scientists have figured out ants communicate with, well, they call them pheromones, but they're not really scents. They don't smell like anything. They're chemical messengers, and they use their antennas both as feeling and as smell organs. And it's really fascinating how they all work in concert with one another. Now, it gets better because if we can look at the next slide, this is a video that lasts about a minute. And I'd like you to just watch what this bird is doing and look at the ground next to the bird. Now, you'll notice that this bird isn't there to eat the ants. But what it's doing is it's letting the ants crawl through its feathers. And birds are attracted to those same kind of ants we saw before that shoot formic acid out of their abdomens. And scientists have figured out, and biologists have done some research about this. There's 23 species of birds that do this kind of behavior. It's called anting. And why are they doing this? Well, it's a real practical thing. Birds are prone to get parasites like ticks and mites. And formic acid acts as a pesticide. It also stimulates a gland that birds have that creates a waxy substance that coats their feathers. Interestingly, and I always like saying it gets better because every time I do research about this stuff, I always find things that are even more incredible. They've found that birds actually will get cigarette butts and rubbing through their feathers. And those of you who garden or farm, you know that nicotine is also a pretty potent pesticide as well. And so here we have conscious, in my opinion, creatures like ants defending themselves with formic acid, and birds taking advantage of that to give themselves a bath. And what's interesting is they'll put up with the ants biting them. As you saw in that video, the birds kind of trying to get the ants from, the birds will put up with that because the advantages are that steep. Now, the next slide has to do with this plant. This is a vine in South America. It's called Bouquilla trifolata. This plant has a remarkable talent. It changes the size, shape, color, orientation, the petiole length, the tip spininess of its leaves to match the leaves of a plant next to it. Now, you can see the yellow arrows. This picture here is from a scientific journal article. Ernesto Giannoli and Fernando Carrasco Ura, they researched this plant and they published in Current Biology. And you can see how the leaves are different shapes, the vines are different. When it gets within 24 inches of a plant, it will change its appearance. They don't know how it does this. they have speculations. One is that somehow the plant is picking up substances from the other plant, and from that information somehow knows what the shape of the leaves are. That seems pretty outrageous because it's really hard to understand how a smell can give you information about a person's shape. But that's the only thing they've come up with. The other one they admit is really speculative, is that there's some kind of horizontal gene transfer. Bacteria from one plant is going into this plant and it's changing its genetic structure. But that seems unlikely because the horizontal gene transfer takes many, many years to accomplish. So this is a mystery. It's an intelligent mystery, though, because this plant does this for a very good reason. It masks itself and it prevents itself from getting eaten. It's kind of like, you know, when you see those schools of fish that all come together and it confuses the predators because they're all working together. Well, the plant imitates the other plants. And so when an herbivore comes to eat it, it doesn't go there, it goes to there because it's all one big mass. So they know about that. And how it does this, of course, what I'm going to say is the plant's conscious. It knows what it's doing because it matches the definition I just said. It's aware of itself, it's aware of its environment, and it's aware of itself in its environment. How else could it do this? Now, some people who are really hardcore rationalists would say, no, it's just random evolution that happened and it's just happening mindlessly. And I've heard that argument. But if we could reverse that, let's say that an alien race that's 1 billion years old comes visiting Earth and they see us and they see a mother raising her child, or they see a father teaching his kids about whatever it is. They see a young man taking piano lessons, let's say. And because they're so advanced, they say, oh, those people, those creatures, those animals, they're just mindless. It's just mindless, random stuff that they've learned accidentally. And it seems to me that that's really not a good way of looking at the human condition. It seems inaccurate to me. And so consequently, I think it's inaccurate to think that all of these wonderful creatures in the world, who I believe are conscious, are just doing things mindlessly. So now I'm going to talk about the mystics and what they thought about consciousness. So I mentioned Plato before. He taught a theory of ideal forms. He believed that all of our sensory experience is just a shadow of true reality, and true reality consists of a realm of eternal forms and ideals. He believed that consciousness might exist independently from our physical form. And from the Platonic point of view, consciousness comes first, and the material reality comes later. And of course, his student Aristotle disagreed and said the opposite. He said that the empirical means is the only means of discovering reality, and our knowledge comes from our physical perceptions. And so for Aristotle, material reality comes first, and our minds just kind of tag along. So if you want to know more about these philosophers, I usually go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's online, it's free, it's great. You'll learn more about philosophy than you will ever want to know. So the reason why this is important is it focuses on the internal question. Is my mind just the meat of my brain? Or is a physical part of my brain like a container or a transmitter of my consciousness? In that case, my consciousness exists autonomously within the larger fabric of the universe. For example, in Plato's realm of ideas, my consciousness is not just between my ears. Now, the Buddhists are remarkably sophisticated in their understanding of consciousness. In the Pali Canon, there's a meditation practice. There are 4 stages. You can travel to a world of infinite space, a world of infinite consciousness, a world of nothingness, a world of neither perception or non-perception. And all these things are very difficult for us in the West to wrap our head around. But if you think about getting rid of the subject-object dichotomy, you know, the Olympics have been happening, and when you watch these athletes, they get in this zone of like, they're not them, they're not the sport. It's just one thing that's happening, and that's why they're so good. We don't have to be a professional athlete for that to happen. I know that when I do gardening, I'm an avid gardener. Sometimes I can think that I'm the one who's doing the gardening, but very often, if I don't constrain my consciousness, I can think that neither I'm doing the gardening or the garden is gardening me, but just gardening is happening. And that I just happened last night. I was just spent a half an hour. I don't know where that half an hour went. All of a sudden it was done. And I realized that I was in this zone of neither subject object. And it was really very cool. So there was no I, there was just gardening. And in the suttas, the Buddhists speak of a mind-made body, a meditative state. A person can make their consciousness leave their body, create a subtle body, invisible, although occupying space. This can be as large as 2 or 3 farmers' fields, it was written, and other abilities include going through walls, diving into the earth like it's water, walking on water, or flying through the air. And they say the Buddha crossed a river by disappearing from one bank and instantaneously appearing on the other. And if you want to read more about this, there's a wonderful book, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, by Alexandra David Niel. She was a Belgian-French explorer in the 19th century, wrote 30 books about Eastern philosophy. In the Hindu tradition, according to Sangeeta Menon at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, classical Advaita Vedanta states that all reality and everything in our world of experience is actually Brahman, an unchanging consciousness. And again, we in the West, we used to have trouble with Brahman because every time someone says there's this one thing, pure consciousness, people have a tendency to think of some old guy in a sky with a big beard, you know, and that's not at all what they're talking about. A person's essence is pure consciousness. It is a state of being that goes beyond the subject, object, time, and space-centered awareness. And it is a challenging question to ask ourselves. If you didn't consider your body, your possessions, your appetites, your identity, your work, your relatives, your loves, what part of your consciousness would be left? And so these are the kind of questions that the mystics brought to us. They all talk about some form of disembodied consciousness separate from this ephemeral physical reality. So what if I insist on being a rational materialist, a person of science, a person of math, a person adhering to a modern description of reality? How can I reconcile these two ways of thinking? So it used to be they were not reconcilable. The Newtonian universe of the 19th century, matter is the only reality. The only thing that matters is having a mathematical formula. Time flows in the same way everywhere, no matter where you are in the universe. And this was all true until the 20th century. And then there was Einstein and there was Max Planck. And Max Planck started the change with quantum theory, a theory that began with the fact that energy does not flow smoothly, but rather in discrete packets. Light was not only waves, but sometimes could be viewed as packets of energy, as particles. We call those particles photons. But it wasn't just energy that had quantum, it was matter. Matter could behave as particles and waves. And so after Max Planck, a whole new way of thinking emerged. Now, before I talk about quantum science, I would like to say that there are many opportunists out there that'll attach the word quantum to anything they wish in order to sell it, you know? So I'm sure if you go on the internet, you can type in quantum crystals and somebody will want to sell you a crystal that will start your car in the winter, you know? So don't buy it because it's a scam. Okay, so that's why I'm going to continue by actually quoting Nobel Prize winning scientists about this subject. So it's all going to be scientific in that sense. So the first one is Carlo Rovelli. He's a theoretical physicist. He wrote many wonderful books about science, and one of them is called 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, a very small book. And he writes, the first to write the equations of quantum mechanics was Werner Heisenberg. Some of you know him. He said that electrons, which are one of the constituents of matters, do not always exist. And we should not think of atoms as things. Electrons only exist when someone watches them. or when they are interacting with something else. An electron is a set of jumps from one interaction to another. Excuse me. When nothing disturbs it, it is not in any precise place. It is not in any place at all. Now, I have a really horrible joke about electrons. Dick, this is for you. Okay. Yes. Did you know that all the electrons in the universe got together and they decided that they wanted to convert to Roman Catholicism? Yes, they did. All of a sudden, they all became Catholics. That's why they have Mass. So the electron does not actually occupy any particular place at any particular time. Scientists are saying this, not mystics, okay? Electrons occupy all places within a cloud of probabilities all at the same time. And it's not just electrons that do this. All the components of matter do the same thing. So Mario Babati, professor of chemistry at the Aix-Marseille University in France, says matter does not fill space. When we pile up objects on top of one another, what keeps them separated is not their masses, but the electric repulsion between the outer electron probability clouds. Matter does not fill space. Energy fills space. And Adam Frank, a wonderful scientist at the University of Rochester, he's an astrophysics professor. He says that quantum physics smears out the position and velocity of matter, turning what we perceive as solid things into probabilities or levels of likelihood of existence, which is something I really love. That's a very cool thing, levels of likelihood of existence. Now, if we can go to slide 6, please. Okay, this is a picture of two ripples, two stones, some of them threw in a pond, and you can see how the ripples are joining with one another and they're interfering with one another. And the reason why I put this up here is I'm going to go to the next slide, please. And this is from a wonderful website called madmath.xyz. If you ever want to do math, that would be the place to go. This is a double slit experiment that was done many years ago. And it proved that light was not particles, but was waves. And what happens is when you shoot light, let's say you get a laser or a flashlight and you have two slits, instead of having two bands on the screen, you'll see an interference pattern similar to when waves interfere with one another. So it's like the peak of the waves amplify one another, and that's why you get that band of light. But in between the band of light, it's dark, and that's when the bottom of the waves cancel each other out. So, and that's what they did. Now, what's interesting, if we can go to the next slide, I put this together. This is two instances of doing this in a scientific experiment, double slit experiment. And we're now going to do this with particles. So we can use electrons, photons, we can use molecules, we can even use BBs or bullets. It doesn't matter. When we set up this experiment, we get the same interference pattern with particles. And that's the thing on the left side of the screen. It says no detectors. Now, what's interesting about this is that if we shoot one particle at a time from this source of particles, it'll still give us the interference pattern. That's right. One particle at a time will do that, which means that the particle is in two places at once. That's actually what scientists will tell you, until it hits the screen and then it decides where to go. Now, if we want to figure out what these particles are doing, we put detectors up there, and that's the right side of the screen. The second experiment, we put two detectors, and we want to know which particles are going to which slit. And when we do that, the interference pattern disappears, and now we have two bands on the screen. When we stop the detectors and we turn off the detectors, it goes back to the. And this experiment was done thousands of times. All the same, happens all the time. So what that means is, it could be that our consciousness changes the particles, or it could mean that the particles know that we're watching them, maybe. See, both things that really seems impossible, right? But that's what happens. So in quantum physics, particles exist as a wave. They can probably be in many places at the same time. They don't materialize until we observe them. Under the right conditions, an event at a point of space, let's say at the moon, if we set it up right, can influence a particle on the Earth, and it'll happen instantaneously, which seems impossible, but that's what happens with these experiments. Now, some scientists believe that our consciousness is interwoven with this reality, which is why these things happen this way. Roger Penrose is one of them. He's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And he and his colleague, Dr. Hameroff, an anesthesiologist, believe the inner workings of our brain function at this quantum level, and these processes are entangled with a kind of universal field of consciousness. There have been some unusual experiments that have been done. Benjamin Libet, he's a neurophysiologist. When people have strokes, sometimes they do brain surgery while they're awake under local anesthesia because they use electric probes to ask them, okay, do you feel this now? Or do you feel your hand? Or you see lights or whatever it is? And they set up this experiment so that they have a PET scan, a live scan of the brain at the same time that these patients they're talking, okay? And they would, okay, we're gonna try to touch the left hemisphere, see if you feel it in your right fingers or whatever. And the scope that they're looking at will show the brain lighting up at 500 milliseconds after the impulse. Oh, what does that mean? That's cool, right? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. So anyway, the brain will react 500 milliseconds, a half a minute, half a second. But when people respond, they respond in 30 milliseconds. They know they're having the impulse before the technicians see their brain react. And we have no explanation for that, except there's something quantum going on in the brain, because quantum structures will induce a backwards in time, and that's exactly what they called it, condition, where it's called non-locality, and the timing is changed. It doesn't relate to our normal physical reality. And so there have been some very serious experiments that are showing that not only in our brains, but in certain animals and certain processes of that in plants that have these quantum structures. So as you can see, the scientific view of reality is not as traditionally rational or materialistic as we may think. And the founders of quantum science knew this, and they believed that there were many unanswered questions about the reality of consciousness and even about the nature of what appears to us as physical reality. And so I'm going to have to agree with Professor Franke. He came up with a theory that says that we should really add consciousness to our list of the qualities we use in science. Qualities like mass or electric charge or magnetism or angular momentum, that consciousness is one of them, woven into the fabric of the universe. And thus we, as conscious beings, are connected to, woven to all life and all energy and all matter in the universe. And so before I close, I want to relate an experiment I did when I was in 8th grade. I had a wonderful science teacher. His name was Mr. Wright. And when you're an 8th grade boy and, you know, when you're doing high school, it's wonderful to have a teacher named Mr. Wright. Even though he spelled his name with a W, you know, he was always right. And so we were studying magnetism. And, you know, when you're in school, you do this experiment with the iron filings and you put the magnet and you put the paper on, you know, and you see the lines of force. Okay, all good. But then he said, we're gonna create a magnet from nothing. And so he gave us an iron bar that was not magnetized. We tried to lift up paper clips, nothing happened, okay? And a hammer. And this is a great junior high school experiment, you know? So you get this big iron bar and you line it up north-south. You line it up with the magnet. And then you hit it real hard for about a minute. You keep hitting it. And what happens after you hit it, it starts picking up things. It magnetizes because it lines up with the Earth's magnetic field. We can't see the magnetic field. We don't know it's there, but it does that kind of thing. Now, that's an analogy for this field of consciousness that I'm proposing. and other scientists have proposed. So the consciousness of these ants and the consciousness of the birds and even the consciousness of this trifoliata vine are all woven into this field. And to me, that's what it has meaning and purpose, and it exposes the nature of reality. And so to conclude, I would like to quote Professor Penrose, who said, there is a certain sense in which I would say the universe has a purpose. It's not there just somehow by chance. Some people take the view that the universe is simply there and it runs along. It's a bit as though it just sort of computes and we happen by accident to find ourselves in this thing. And I don't think that's a very fruitful or helpful way of looking at the universe. I think that there is something much deeper about it, about its existence, which we have very little inkling of at the moment. Thank you for listening today.